the blood of sons, the bones of empires. In a city built on water, where the gods ruled with fire and fury, the Aztecs rose from nothing. Their empire was forged in blood, their power earned with every kill, every conquest, and every sacrifice. They came from the dust. No land, no allies, no mercy. Only the fury of a god that demanded tribute, and the will to take it by force. They weren't born kings. They carved their empire from the battlefield, one skull at a time. The Battle of the Flowers, the conquest of Oaxaca, the Tepanec War. These were not just victories, they were brutal declarations. The Aztecs would be kings of blood and stone. This was a world where men rose to power by crushing their enemies and stacking their bodies like offerings to the gods. Where war never stopped, and neither did the sound of drums that called warriors to slaughter. They built pyramids that towered over the earth, pulled water from the heavens, and made cities bloom on lakes. Impossible feats, crafted by hands soaked in the blood of their enemies. But peace? They didn't build peace. The Aztec Empire was built on fear and tribute, a machine fueled by violence. Each conquest, each victory, ended with the blade in the heart. The sun rose only after the gods were appeased with blood, and the price of power was steep. Every conquest, every step forward, brought them closer to their ultimate reckoning. But as fast as they rose, they fell. Not quietly, not slowly, but with the clang of steel, the roar of betrayal, and the scream of a dying empire. The gods were silent. Moctezuma, once their untouchable emperor, saw the omens, and then saw them ignored. He placed his faith in strangers, in Spaniards, and it cost him everything. Cortés burned his ships on the shore and took the heart of the empire hostage, and the world would never be the same again. The festival of Toxcatl was supposed to be a sacred ritual. Instead, it became a massacre. The unarmed nobles slaughtered in cold blood, and the drums that had once heralded victory now echoed the sound of an empire's death. This is not a slow decline. This is a crash, a fall that shakes the earth, a war of betrayal, a conquest of deceit, a city of gods torn apart by plagues and steel. This is what happens when power thinks it cannot fall, when kings confuse loyalty with fear, when gods stop listening. This is not a legend. This is the rise and the fall of the Aztec Empire. Part 1. Born of migration, destined for blood. They claimed their origin from a place lost to history, Aztlan, a land of 7 caves and sacred waters, where their ancestors lived in peace before destiny uprooted them. No map could point to it. No ruin remains. It was more than a homeland. It was a myth, a sacred memory engraved into the soul of a wandering people. These were the Mexica, later known to the world as the Aztecs, not born into greatness, but driven toward it by something far more terrifying than ambition: divine instruction. Their journey began not in triumph, but in humiliation. Shunned by settled city-states, rejected as savages, the Mexica drifted through central Mesoamerica as nomads, unwelcome in the lands of others. Their clothes were ragged, their stomachs empty, and their only claim to dignity was the voice of a god who demanded they keep moving. That god was Huitzilopochtli, the war deity who had once fought the moon and stars at birth. He was not gentle. He was not forgiving. He was a commander who ruled through visions and blood, and he gave them one order: to search for the sign that would mark their promised land, an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. For years, decades, they wandered. Generations of Mexica were born and buried without seeing the sign. Other tribes saw them as little more than pests, useful only as mercenaries in their endless local wars. They were hired to fight and then cast out when they became too bold or too numerous. In one infamous incident, they dared to ask for the hand of a Colhua princess in marriage, only to horrify their hosts by sacrificing her and flaying her skin in a ritual offering. That act cemented their reputation as dangerous pariahs, but it also revealed a truth: the Mexica would not bend. Their loyalty was to the god who led them, not the politics of those who scorned them. Their search led them into the Valley of Mexico, a region already crowded with kingdoms and cultures. Tolteca heirs, Nahua-speaking lords, and city-states locked in ceaseless rivalries. The Mexica, landless and despised, were forced to settle in the worst of it, a marshy island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, choked with reeds and riddled with brine. But when they looked upon that barren water, they saw what no one else had: the sign. The eagle was there, the cactus, the serpent, not on a hilltop or fertile plain, but in the middle of the lake, as if the gods themselves dared them to try. They accepted the challenge. With hands blistered and tools of wood and stone, they began to claim the lake itself. They laid down mud and timber to build land where there was none. They planted on floating gardens. They erected altars. They named the place Tenochtitlan in honor of their ancestral leader Tenoch, and swore it would one day rival the great cities of their enemies. They were still mocked, still distrusted, still forced to serve other powers. But their foundation was laid not on soil, but on faith. Their identity was not borrowed, it was forged. They were a people built by hardship, sharpened by rejection, and guided by a god who never promised ease, only conquest. This was no ordinary origin story. This was a crucible. The Mexica emerged from it not as victims of circumstance, but as instruments of divine will. And in the silent heart of the lake, where others saw swamp and ruin, they saw the throne of an empire waiting to be claimed. The founding of Tenochtitlan, 1325 AD. Tenochtitlan did not rise because the land was good. It rose because no one else dared to build there. When the Mexica arrived on the swampy island in the heart of Lake Texcoco, they had no army, no allies, and no permission. What they had was vision, backed by desperation, discipline, and divine pressure. The earth beneath their feet was soft and unstable. The waters around them were brackish and cruel. But they looked at that water and saw the bones of a future capital. They did not tame the land. They remade it. Piece by piece, stone by stone, they transformed a sunken wasteland into a city that would challenge the greatest in Mesoamerica. They learned how to drive stakes deep into the lakebed and pile earth to form artificial islands. These man-made plots became floating fields, chinampas, where crops grew in perfect rows, watered naturally by the surrounding canals. What began as survival became innovation. What began as a foothold became an empire's heart. In just a few generations, Tenochtitlan became more than a settlement. It became an engine of construction. Canals sliced through the city like veins, carrying people and goods on canoes between neighborhoods. Causeways stretched out from the island like arms, connecting them to the shore, but also controlling who could come and go. The city was defended by nature and design, isolated and protected by the very water that once tried to drown them. At the center of this new urban miracle stood the Templo Mayor, a temple not just for prayer, but for domination. It was built in layers, each ruler expanding it to mark their reign. Twin staircases climbed skyward, one for Huitzilopochtli, god of war, and one for Tlaloc, god of rain. The alignment was no accident. It faced the rising sun on the day of the spring equinox. From the first stone, the Mexica made clear that this city would live by cosmic order. Heaven would look down and recognize its own geometry. Every inch of Tenochtitlan was planned with precision. The cardinal points shaped the layout. Astronomy dictated architecture. Religious cycles controlled city life. This was not merely a home, it was a divine machine. Foreign visitors, even rivals, arrived in disbelief. By the early 15th century, Tenochtitlan had streets cleaner than most European capitals, markets that could feed tens of thousands, and aqueducts channeling fresh water from distant springs. But all of it had been born in silence. Without war, without conquest, before the first blade was drawn or the first tribute demanded. This was the phase of creation, and the Mexica had proven their right to exist not with battle, but with brilliance. What once was mud had become monument. What once was exile had become elevation. Tenochtitlan stood, proud, powerful, and ready. The time for building had ended. The time for empire was about to begin. Part 2. An empire built on bones. Rise through war and marriage. Before the Aztecs could conquer, they had to be accepted. And that was far harder than war. Tenochtitlan had been built, but legitimacy was still out of reach. The Mexica were viewed as imposters, uncultured mercenaries squatting on sacred land. Their bloodline held no ancient royal claim. In a world obsessed with noble descent and sacred ancestry, they were seen as upstarts, or worse, usurpers. But they had a plan. They would marry into power and break tradition in the process. Culhuacan was one of the oldest city-states in the valley, respected and steeped in prestige. When the Mexica asked for a princess of Culhua blood, it was more than a political request. It was a bold move to rebrand their lineage. They wanted a connection to Toltec nobility, the gold standard of civilization. Culhuacan agreed, seeing a chance to manipulate the growing city on the lake. What they didn't expect was sacrifice. The Mexica, following their strict ritual code, flayed the princess and used her skin in a religious ceremony. To them, it was an honor. To the Culhua, it was horror. An alliance became a declaration of war. The Mexica were chased from their temporary settlement, forced into the lake's marshes, yet again abandoned and cursed. But exile taught them more than diplomacy ever could. They learned how to turn humiliation into resolve. They watched the battlefield carefully, how terrain could be used to trap, how patience could win against numbers, how fear could be wielded more effectively than steel. These weren't just skirmishes, they were classrooms. Every defeat sharpened them. Every loss was dissected and studied. The Mexica were becoming warriors not by tradition, but by necessity. When fighting as allies for other cities, they began to earn recognition not for their honor, but for their results. They fought ruthlessly. They rarely retreated, and they didn't just win, they humiliated. It was during this time that their leaders realized brute force wasn't enough. Power required strategy, and strategy meant more than bloodshed. So they returned to the idea of marriage, but this time with calculation. They began forging targeted unions with lesser noble families, ones hungry for influence. Instead of reaching too high, they worked laterally, integrating into the political web of the valley. These alliances did not carry the prestige of ancient bloodlines, but they created a network of loyalists, informants, and future collaborators who had something to gain from the Mexica's rise. Through these unions, the Mexica started to gain access to internal politics, trade routes, and most critically, military opportunities. They were no longer hired blades, they were becoming stakeholders. Slowly, silently, the lines of loyalty began to shift. And as they expanded their reach, their approach to warfare matured. They stopped fighting like cornered animals and started striking like tacticians. They began to win not through size, but through surprise. Their ambush tactics became legendary. Their scouts mapped trails no one else dared to follow. They could appear, strike, and vanish before their enemies had time to call reinforcements. The Mexica were no longer outcasts. They were becoming contenders, and their enemies, for the first time, began to look at them not with scorn, but with caution. The foundation had been laid. Tenochtitlan was no longer just a city, it was a player, and the lake that once isolated them now served as a fortress. From here on, every alliance, every sword drawn, and every drop of blood spilled would no longer be for survival. It would be for dominance. The Triple Alliance, 1428 AD. The year 1428 marked the moment when Tenochtitlan stopped reacting and started controlling. Until now, the Mexica had moved carefully. Strategic marriages, calculated battles, patience dressed as loyalty. But power, real power, never comes without betrayal. and theirs would be timed to perfection. At the center of the storm was the Tepanec Empire. Brutal, wealthy, and overconfident. Ruled by the aging king Tezazamoc, the Tepanecs dominated the Valley of Mexico like a clenched fist. They taxed their allies, they crippled their rivals. Tenochtitlan, though growing stronger, still answered to them, on paper. But paper burns easily. The moment came after Tezozamoc's death. His son, Maxla, seized power through fear and manipulation. He saw the Mexica as a threat, not a vassal, and moved quickly to isolate them. Assassinations, embargoes, provocations. Maxla wanted submission. What he got instead was revolution. Itzcoatl, the fourth king of Tenochtitlan, was not interested in bowing to anyone. Quiet, intelligent, and ruthless, he was the perfect match for what came next. But even he did not act alone. His advisor, a name still whispered with awe and fear, was Tlacaelel, a thinker who saw empire not as territory, but as belief. Together, they struck the match. They reached out to Texcoco, a city that had once been conquered by the Tepanecs, and whose rightful heir, Nezahualcoyotl, lived in exile. Nezahualcoyotl was no ordinary prince. He was a poet with a sword, a warrior with vision. He had fled through forests, raised guerrilla armies, studied law, and waited, patiently, for the right moment to return. He now had it. Tenochtitlan and Texcoco allied, and with them came Tlacopan, a smaller city with a strategic position and a grudge of its own. The three cities bound themselves together, not with trust, but with common enemies. Thus, the Triple Alliance was born, three blades pointed at the same throat. War came fast. Swift raids turned into open battles. Mexica's soldiers used the lake to strike unexpectedly. Texcocan forces flanked from the east. Tlacopan controlled the bridges. The Tepanec strongholds fell one by one. Maxla was captured and executed without ceremony. The old masters were dead. But it wasn't just a military victory, it was a transformation of identity. Tlacaelel saw the opportunity to do what few men in history have dared, rewrite the very soul of a people. He ordered the burning of ancient records, histories that painted the Mexica as low-born mercenaries and wanderers. In their place, he crafted a narrative of divine selection. No longer would the Mexica be tolerated. They would be revered. He declared that their god, Huitzilopochtli, had not only guided them, but chosen them above all others. That the universe itself demanded human sacrifice. That the sun required blood to rise each day. And that the Mexica, as his most loyal children, were responsible for feeding that hunger. This was no metaphor. It was policy. The temples expanded, the rituals intensified. Conquest became not just expansion, but obligation. Every battle, every captive taken, every city subdued was a holy act. Soldiers were not just warriors, they were priests with blades. "We are chosen," Tlacaelel said. "The world must bleed to feed the sun." This was the new doctrine. It justified terror. It sanctified war. It erased the shame of the past and replaced it with a brutal kind of glory. The Triple Alliance would not just rule the valley, it would swallow it. And from the ashes of their enemies, an empire was now preparing to rise. One soaked in sacrifice, driven by faith, and engineered for dominance. The Mexica had waited long enough. Now they would take everything. Part 3. Glory in War, Terror in Tribute. The Eagle and the Jaguar, Warriors and War Machines. By the mid-15th century, the Mexica were no longer building a city. They were feeding an empire, and to feed it, they needed warriors, more than ever, stronger than ever, deadlier than ever. They didn't build an army, they built a war machine. It wasn't just size, it was structure. From the bottom up, the Aztec military was a ruthless hierarchy of blood-earned rank. At its core stood two elite orders, the Eagle Warriors and the Jaguar Knights. They were not defined by wealth or birth. They were defined by what they brought back from the battlefield, alive. To rise in rank, a soldier had to capture, not kill, his enemies. Not just once, but repeatedly. The goal wasn't destruction, it was procurement. War became a ritual of precision. The enemy was subdued, bound, and marched back to the capital. Not for ransom, not for imprisonment, but for offering. This was the foundation of the Flower Wars. Conflicts fought not to claim land or resources, but to secure living bodies for sacrifice. Agreements were made in advance. Battlefields were chosen. Cities took turns providing warriors. It was warfare with choreography and intent. To outsiders, it was madness. To the Aztecs, it was sacred order. Victories were not counted in dead soldiers, but in captives processed through the temples. Once taken, the defeated met their end at the top of the pyramid. Hearts cut out while still beating, skulls displayed on tzompantli, racks made of wooden beams and horizontal spears, holding hundreds of heads like trophies in a gallery of terror. Some victims were skinned, their hides worn by priests who impersonated gods. Others were dismembered as divine tribute. These were not random acts of violence. They were carefully staged performances meant to awe the people and honor the sun. Terror became part of statecraft. The mere threat of what waited in Tenochtitlan kept many provinces obedient without resistance. And there were many. The empire expanded in every direction. From the highlands of Oaxaca to the humid Gulf Coast, from mountain cities to coastal villages, the Aztecs absorbed them all. Tribute flowed into the capital in endless streams. Cacao, jade, cotton, obsidian, gold, and human cargo. The state was divided into 38 provinces, each under tight surveillance, each required to pay regularly or face swift punishment. Over 5 million subjects lived under Aztec rule, and none were equal. There was the heart of the empire, and there were those who fed it. The Aztec army was more than a fighting force. It was a tool of ideology, economy, and intimidation. Even priests could serve as warriors, leading campaigns blessed by omens and soaked in doctrine. A single campaign could deliver hundreds of captives. A successful general didn't just return with loot, he returned with cosmic favor. Failure was not an option. Cowards were punished worse than enemies. Discipline was absolute. Warriors fought not just for glory, but for their place in the afterlife. The highest honor was to die in battle or under the knife. Either way, your blood served the gods. The empire's expansion wasn't fueled by greed, it was fueled by belief. Every new conquest wasn't just a province gained. It was a step toward keeping the universe alive. The Mexica had become more than rulers. They were agents of divine hunger. And war was how they fed it. Economy of blood and maize. Empire demands more than warriors, it demands supply. And the Aztecs didn't just fight, they extracted. Their economy wasn't built on currency, it was built on control. Tribute was the bloodstream of the empire. Every city-state, every conquered region was given a clear demand: pay or face ruin. This was no optional exchange. It was law, codified, enforced, ruthless. From the jungles came cacao beans, the currency of trade and the drink of nobility. From the valleys, cotton cloth, white and dyed, woven by hand and counted by the thousand. Jade and obsidian arrived from the mines, carved into blades and ornaments. Gold, rarely used for coins, was shaped into masks, earrings, and chest plates. And always, always came warriors, whether as fighters, servants, or sacrifices. Each province owed a quota. Each failure to deliver meant military retaliation. There was no ambiguity. Even grain and salt were tallied and transported to the capital. The tribute lists read like inventory ledgers for a god. Feathered capes, shield bundles, live birds, dried chilies, skins, baskets of snails. The Mexica did not waste a single resource, nor did they tolerate delay. And at the center of this machine, feeding it all, was a marvel of agriculture, the chinampa. Floating gardens, built from nothing, anchored by willow trees and packed with fertile lake mud, these rectangular plots defied the landscape and rewrote the laws of farming. The Chinampas turned water into breadbasket. Harvests came not once or twice, but up to 7 times a year. Corn, tomatoes, beans, squash, amaranth, medicinal herbs, even flowers used in ceremony and tribute were grown on the Chinampas. With limited dry land, the Mexica didn't bend to nature, they weaponized it. Every inch of the lake became production. It was sustainable, scalable, and brilliantly efficient. By the height of the empire, Tenochtitlan and its surrounding regions fed hundreds of thousands. Famine became a weapon of policy, not a natural disaster. But while food filled stomachs, trade filled coffers. And there was one place above all where the empire revealed its wealth in full: Tlatelolco. Tlatelolco, the twin city of Tenochtitlan, housed the empire's greatest market, an open-air colossus that pulsed with thousands of voices, deals, and displays every single day. Spanish eyewitnesses, men hardened by war and raised in European capitals, stood frozen in awe at what they saw. They recorded it with disbelief. There were sections for everything: pottery, metals, herbs, textiles, armor, exotic animals, dyes, honey, fish, even insects. Judges stood ready to settle disputes. Inspectors ensured fair weights. Merchants traveled from far beyond the valley just to trade beneath its banners. No currency was printed, but everything had a value: cacao, cotton mantles, slaves, even axes made of copper. This wasn't primitive. It was advanced, regulated, respected. And like everything in the empire, it was watched closely. The state knew who traded what, who profited, and who owed. Nothing moved in the market that wasn't part of the larger machine. Even commerce bowed to empire. The Mexica understood something that many civilizations forgot. Domination is not just about swords, it's about systems. Their economy was built on balance: agriculture below, tribute above, and trade at the center. And while other nations bled themselves dry in war, the Aztecs turned tribute into power, maize into strength, and markets into monuments of influence. They had created more than a military empire. They had created an empire that fed itself. Part 4. Bloodline of Gods and Tyrants. Montezuma I to Ahuitzotl, builders of empire. Some empires are made in war. Others are made in stone. With the foundation of tribute secured and the machinery of conquest grinding forward, the Mexica turned to something even more lasting than victory: legacy. And that legacy would be etched by 2 rulers, Montezuma I and Ahuitzotl. Montezuma I, also called Motecuzoma Ilhuicamina, was not a warrior by impulse, but by duty. He expanded the reach of the empire further than any of his predecessors, launching campaigns that swept through the Mixtec and Zapotec regions to the south. He tightened imperial control over tribute provinces and imposed reforms that transformed the empire from a loosely held alliance into a centralized force with clear command. But his most profound impact wasn't just military, it was monumental. He ordered the first great expansion of the Templo Mayor, raising the temple into the sky, amplifying its sacred power and its political symbolism. Under his rule, the city's ceremonial core became a stage for power, a place where enemies were paraded, gods were fed, and citizens were reminded of who ruled them and why. Montezuma III also introduced structural reforms that began binding conquered regions into a shared identity. Local rulers were allowed to stay in place, but they answered directly to the emperor. Infrastructure was improved. Regional centers were fortified. Roads became arteries of control, not just trade. And when he died, the empire didn't slow, it surged. Ahuitzotl, his successor and nephew, was not a builder of foundations. He was a builder of empires at full speed. Under his iron rule, the Mexica reached their greatest geographical extent. He launched aggressive campaigns across southern highlands and deep into the coastal jungles, crushing resistance and annexing dozens of territories into the imperial network. Where Montezuma laid groundwork, Ahuitzotl delivered domination. To mark the climax of expansion, he rebuilt the Templo Mayor again, larger, higher, more terrifying than ever. Its dedication ceremony became a legend so shocking it still sparks debate. Reports claim 80,000 captives were sacrificed over 4 days. While the number remains contested, the message was undeniable. The empire had reached divine proportions. Its gods were pleased, its enemies were warned. But Ahuitzotl was more than blood and fire. He was an engineer of ambition. Under his reign, Tenochtitlan's infrastructure underwent a transformation. The city's growing population demanded clean water, so aqueducts were extended across long distances to deliver it from mountain springs. To protect against seasonal floods, dikes were constructed with astonishing precision, massive barriers of stone and mud that regulated the lake's rise and fall. These weren't simple fixes, they were feats of urban mastery. Temples were not just larger, they were layered in astronomical meaning. City layout followed ritual logic. Marketplaces expanded, roads were carved, diplomats were dispatched. Every piece of the empire was being hardened into permanence. Ahuitzotl had no tolerance for stagnation. He ruled with urgency, forcing the empire to grow or collapse. There was no pause, no retreat. Every campaign, every wall raised, every prisoner brought back from distant wars served the same purpose: to prove the Mexica were not just favored by the gods, but inseparable from them. By the end of his reign, the empire was stretched across mountains, forests, deserts, and coastlines. It ruled over languages it didn't speak and people it didn't resemble, and yet it held. Ahuitzotl died at the peak of power in a city of stone and sacrifice, where the streets were paved with tribute and the air thick with incense and command. His death left a throne cloaked in glory, but shadowed by pressure. Because when you rise that high, there's only one direction left. Moctezuma II, the philosopher king turned despot. When Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, known to the world as Moctezuma II, took the throne, he inherited an empire that was vast, brutal, and confident. But he saw something else beneath the gold and glory. He saw cracks. Unlike his predecessors, Moctezuma was not shaped by the battlefield. He was trained in temples, fluent in astronomy, history, and theology. He was a scholar, not a conqueror, at first. He read signs in the stars, measured the seasons, consulted prophecies, and believed that fate did not belong to men, but to the gods above. When he ascended, he did not reach outward, he looked inward. He began tightening power around the throne with obsessive precision. No longer would regional lords operate with loose autonomy. Moctezuma centralized administration under imperial oversight. Provincial officials were replaced with loyalists from Tenochtitlan. Reports were scrutinized, judges were watched. Even distant temples began answering directly to the capital. To the common citizen, it felt like order. But to the nobility, it felt like a trap. Old families, who had once shared the power of expansion, now found themselves constrained, inspected, even replaced. Moctezuma trusted few, questioned many, and surrounded himself with diviners and priests more than with warriors. He removed himself from public ceremonies, became elusive to even his council, and demanded that messengers dismount and avert their gaze before speaking to him. And then came the signs. A series of omens began shaking the empire's certainty. A strange flame hovered in the night sky for weeks. Some said a comet, others a tear in the heavens. A temple caught fire without cause. Lightning struck the statue of Huitzilopochtli without a storm. In Texcoco, children were born with deformities, limbs twisted, faces doubled. Rivers overflowed, drowning crops. The winds turned violent, and the sky seemed to shudder. Moctezuma didn't dismiss these as coincidences. He interpreted them as judgment. He believed the gods were angry at the people, at the priests, perhaps at him. He ordered more sacrifices, more prayers, more divination. He demanded that every advisor report unusual dreams. He summoned mystics from across the empire to explain the unnatural, but none could give him peace. The more he searched for answers, the more distant the gods seemed to become. And in that silence, fear took root. He became haunted by time itself, obsessed with calendars, cycles, and predictions. He feared that the age of their dominion, the fifth sun, was drawing to a close. Every flood became a warning, every eclipse a sentence. His empire, though still powerful, began to feel brittle. The certainty that had fueled expansion under Ahuitzotl was replaced by ritual hesitation. He delayed decisions. He second-guessed reports. And when strange rumors reached him of bearded men landing on distant shores, he didn't prepare for battle. He prepared for prophecy. Moctezuma, once crowned in majesty, now ruled through dread. His intellect, once his strength, became a cage. His faith, once a pillar, became a storm. He isolated himself in divine calculations, while unrest grew quietly beneath him. And when the real danger finally arrived, it didn't find a warrior on the throne. It found a king searching the stars for answers. Part 5. The Storm from the East. The arrival of Cortés, 1519 AD. Hernán Cortés lands, burns his ships. In 1519, the Aztec Empire faced its most dangerous enemy and didn't even know it yet. He came not with a fleet, but with fire in his veins and conquest in his heart. Hernán Cortés, a minor nobleman from Spain with more ambition than rank, set foot on the shores of the Yucatan with a plan as reckless as it was effective. Land, conquer, and never go back. The moment he arrived, he made his decision final. He ordered his ships destroyed, scuttled, stripped, and sunk. There would be no retreat, no turning around. For him and his men, it was victory or death. That single act told his army and the world exactly who he was. This was not a man on expedition. This was a man starting a war. He brought with him 600 soldiers, not an army by any standard. But they didn't fight like ordinary men. They were trained in Europe's most brutal conflicts, hardened by war in Italy and North Africa. They were disciplined, hungry, and armed with tools the Aztecs had never seen. They carried crossbows, arquebuses, and steel blades, weapons that could pierce armor, punch through wood, and slash through flesh with terrifying ease. With them came cannons, loud and devastating, that shattered enemy morale before the first charge. Alongside the men marched 16 horses, massive and unknown in the New World. To the native eye, these beasts turned men into monsters, half human, half thunder. But it wasn't the weapons alone that made Cortés dangerous. It was his mind. He knew he was outnumbered. He knew he had no reinforcements. But he also knew one truth: empires fall faster from within than from without. He had no intention of marching straight to Tenochtitlan. He intended to unravel it one ally at a time. And the first step was to understand the land, its people, its politics, and its divisions. What Cortés brought was not just a foreign army. He brought an infection of strategy, manipulation, and fear. And once it took root, the empire would never be the same. Because while the Mexica looked to omens in the sky, the real threat had already touched the shore. Cortés allies with the Tlaxcalans, bitter enemies of the Aztecs. Cortés knew brute force alone wouldn't be enough to take an empire, but he also knew something the Aztecs had ignored for too long. Hatred can be harvested. The Mexica had enemies, not just rivals, not just outsiders, bitter, blood-soaked enemies, and among them, none were more fierce than the Tlaxcalans. The Tlaxcalan Confederation, an independent highland republic surrounded by hostile territory, had fought the Aztecs for generations. They had resisted tribute, repelled invasions, and turned flower wars into real wars. They weren't just resisting conquest. They were fighting for survival, for pride, for revenge. When Cortés reached their territory, he didn't find allies. He found attackers. The Tlaxcalans saw foreign armor and charged. The battle was savage. The Spaniards nearly broke. But something changed when Cortés didn't retreat. He held the line. He negotiated through blood, and the Tlaxcalans listened. What followed wasn't peace. It was an unholy alliance forged in desperation and mutual interest. The Tlaxcalans wanted the Aztec Empire gone, burned, broken. They had watched their neighbors fall one by one. They knew Tenochtitlan's cruelty, its appetite for tribute, for sacrifice, for submission. Cortés, to them, wasn't a savior. He was a weapon. So they handed him numbers, thousands of warriors, guides, scouts, political intelligence, local dialects, secret routes, and most important of all, motivation. The Tlaxcalans didn't fight for gold. They fought to settle scores. They fought to crush the empire that had treated them like prey. With this alliance, Cortés changed the rules of the game. He was no longer an invader. He was now the front of a civil war. The Spanish banner marched alongside native forces who knew every trail, every weakness, every place where Aztec arrogance had left wounds. The Aztecs believed themselves invincible in isolation. But isolation became their cage. Because the man they dismissed as a distant threat had just made common cause with their oldest enemy. And the war was no longer between continents. It had become a war of vengeance. The translator duo, Malinche and Geronimo de Aguilar. In the chaos of conquest, steel wasn't the sharpest weapon, language was. And Hernán Cortés wielded it with devastating precision because he had two voices that opened more doors than any blade ever could. Geronimo de Aguilar and Malinche. Geronimo de Aguilar was a Spanish priest shipwrecked years before the invasion. Captured by the Maya, he escaped slavery and survived by adopting their tongue. When Cortés found him, Aguilar had forgotten the taste of Europe, but not its words. He became the first bridge between the Spanish and the native world, translating Mayan dialects into Castilian. But it wasn't enough. Aguilar didn't speak Nahuatl, the language of the empire. That's where Malinche changed history. Her name was Malintzin, later baptized as Doña Marina, but history would remember her as La Malinche, a Nahua woman given to the Spaniards as tribute. She wasn't just fluent in Nahuatl. She understood politics, hierarchy, gesture, tone. She saw the empire from the inside, and within days saw how to speak its code to outsiders. Together, Malinche and Aguilar formed a living chain of translation, Nahuatl to Maya, Maya to Spanish. But Malinche quickly outgrew the need for a middleman. She learned Spanish rapidly. Soon, she became Cortés's direct voice. And more than that, his strategist. She wasn't just repeating words. She was interpreting intentions, reading silences, decoding threats. She stood beside Cortés in councils with native rulers. She explained traditions, customs, etiquette, and offenses before they were made. She warned of betrayals. She exposed weaknesses. She softened commands and sharpened negotiations. In every meeting, she turned the tide, not through force, but through fluency. And she wasn't neutral. Malinche had been sold, traded, and passed through powerful hands before falling into Spanish control. She knew what it meant to be voiceless. Now, she was rewriting the script. Some would later call her traitor, others survivor. But in the heat of conquest, she was neither. She was essential. Without her, Cortés would have been blind and deaf. With her, he became unstoppable. Together, Malinche and Aguilar unlocked cities, flipped alliances, and dismantled the veil of mystery surrounding the empire. They made the invisible visible. They didn't carry weapons, but their words cut through centuries of power in days. And with every sentence spoken, the walls of the empire grew thinner, because in war, knowing how your enemy speaks is knowing where to strike. Cortés sang as Quetzalcoatl. Returning, debated, but powerful narrative. As Cortés advanced deeper into the valley, word of his arrival traveled faster than his steps. And what it stirred was not just fear, it stirred prophecy. Among the Mexica elite, whispers began to surface. Whispers tied not to politics or war, but to myth. Some believed the foreign figure marching inland wasn't a man at all, but a returning god. That god was Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, a creator deity, lawgiver, bringer of order and civilization. A god who, according to ancient tradition, had once ruled, vanished across the eastern sea, and vowed to return. And now, from that same direction came Cortés, light-skinned, bearded, mounted on beasts no one had ever seen, armed with thunder, speaking strange tongues, surrounded by chaos. To some, it felt less like invasion and more like destiny catching up. Did Moctezuma himself believe Cortés was Quetzalcoatl returned? That remains debated. Some sources claim he hesitated, overwhelmed by omens and timing. Others argue it was a diplomatic tactic, a mask worn in public to buy time, while his priests and generals measured the threat behind closed doors. What is certain is this: the narrative took hold. Whether rooted in belief or fear, the idea seeped into the minds of nobles, priests, and commoners alike. How do you kill a god? How do you resist someone who might be fulfilling sacred time? When conquest becomes entangled with prophecy, hesitation replaces clarity. Action freezes. Doubt becomes disease. Cortés, whether he understood the full weight of it or not, stepped into that void with confidence. He let the confusion work in his favor. He presented himself with calm, with ceremony, with patience. All traits associated with Quetzalcoatl. He didn't deny the comparisons. He didn't need to. He let the myth do his work. This wasn't manipulation. It was psychological warfare woven through theology. And it worked. Some messengers didn't fight him. They knelt. Some towns didn't resist. They opened gates. The Mexica, masters of intimidation, were now facing a weapon they had never encountered: their own cosmic uncertainty. Because in a world ruled by cycles, signs, and divine timing, what if this wasn't conquest? What if it was prophecy unfolding, one mistake at a time? Diplomacy, deceit, and the march to Tenochtitlan. Welcomed into Tenochtitlan by Moctezuma II, cautious or submissive. On November 8, 1519, Hernán Cortés and his foreign-led army stood at the edge of the causeway. Before them, Tenochtitlan, the shining capital of the Mexica world. Behind them, a trail of uneasy allies, burning villages, and shifting loyalties. At the city gates, the man who ruled it all stood waiting: Moctezuma II. What followed is one of the most debated moments in the history of conquest, a meeting that changed the fate of an empire. Moctezuma did not meet Cortés with soldiers. He met him with gifts. Cloaks of feathered artistry, necklaces of jade, golden discs, and polished words. It wasn't weakness, it was calculation. The emperor had every reason to stall, to assess, to hold his cards close. This wasn't a simple greeting, it was a controlled performance. But in a world defined by strict protocol, appearances mattered. And when Moctezuma stepped down from his litter, walked forward, and touched the earth in greeting, it looked, to many, like submission. Some claim Moctezuma believed he was confronting a divine being. Others argue he was buying time, setting a trap, manipulating Cortés with courtesy. But whatever the motive, one truth cut through the spectacle: he let them in. The Spaniards crossed the causeways and entered the sacred capital unopposed. Cortés was brought not just into the city, but into its very heart. He and his men were given residence in the palace of Axayacatl, just steps from the Templo Mayor. They were treated as honored guests, given food, interpreters, and freedom to move. Under watch, but not chains. To some nobles, this hospitality was treason. To the emperor, it was a high-stakes test of control. Was this diplomacy under pressure, or fear mistaken for caution? Whatever Moctezuma's intentions, the balance had shifted. An emperor known for ritual control, for celestial caution, for divine timing, had welcomed armed strangers into his most sacred space. And now, inside the city walls, the enemy no longer had to fight their way in. They were already there, Aztecs stunned by horses, steel, firearms. For all their mastery in war, the Mexica had never seen an enemy like this. When the Spanish marched through the heart of Tenochtitlan, eyes followed them, silent, wide, uncertain. Not out of respect, out of shock. The weapons these strangers carried weren't just unfamiliar, they were unnatural. Mexica warriors had trained their entire lives for battle. obsidian-edged swords, atlatls, slings, spears. They fought with precision, discipline, and ceremony. But nothing in their world could explain what they now witnessed. The horses moved like monsters, towering, fast, controlled by legs and reins, not whips. Their hooves cracked stone. Their riders struck from above. To a people who had never known large land animals, the image alone shattered assumptions. Warrior and beast merged into one charging force. In battle, it was chaos, men thrown, formations broken, fear ignited in seconds. Then came the steel, not bronze or bone, but hard, unyielding metal. Spanish swords cut through cotton armor and bone with ease. Shields splintered, helms cracked. Where obsidian could slice, steel could shatter. Spanish armor, forged for European wars, turned aside darts and blows that would kill an ordinary man. It wasn't just the blade that terrified. It was that nothing seemed to stop it. And then the gods of thunder spoke. The firearms, slow to reload, inaccurate by modern standards, were devastating in their moment. Every shot broke the rhythm of war. The sound alone, unheard, unplaced, unnatural, sent warriors reeling. Smoke burst from sticks that spat fire. The air cracked like lightning. Warriors panicked not from wounds, but from confusion. Nothing in their training prepared them for that kind of violence. When the first cannon fired, the city flinched. Walls shook, birds scattered, and the enemy, fewer in number, suddenly felt much larger. The Aztecs were not cowards. They did not run from pain. But they understood balance in war, ritual, expectation, rules. This enemy broke all of them. They attacked without warning. They struck from a distance. They didn't take captives. They aimed to kill. The Mexica had crushed rebellions, fought seasoned rivals, and won brutal campaigns. But what stood inside their capital now didn't fight for land or tribute. It fought like a storm, metal, smoke, and speed. And for the first time, the warriors of Tenochtitlan found themselves not in control of battle, but caught in something they couldn't yet understand. Cortés takes Moctezuma hostage. Massacre at the Festival of Tenochtitlan. What Cortés couldn't conquer from the outside, he dismantled from within. Days after being welcomed into the capital, he made his move. Not with an army, not with siege weapons, but with a plan only a gambler would try. He took the emperor hostage. Moctezuma, divine ruler, voice of gods, king of kings, was quietly seized and held under guard in his own city. No grand arrest, no open battle. The Spaniards moved fast, surgical. They claimed it was for protection, a temporary precaution, just until matters could be settled. But behind the smile was a threat. The real power of the empire had just been caged. The palace turned from sanctuary to prison. Moctezuma gave orders, but only under watch. He received visitors, but not in private. He still wore the crown, but every command came with a shadow. The Mexica nobility watched, stunned, confused, furious, but unsure whether to resist. How do you revolt when your own god king is under foreign control? That paralysis would cost them dearly. Then came Tenochtitlan, one of the holiest festivals of the year, a sacred celebration of Tezcatlipoca, lord of sorcery and fate. Dancers moved in perfect rhythm. Music rose. Nobles in full regalia performed the steps that had been passed down for generations. This was no ordinary event. It was ritual, identity, memory, and it became a bloodbath. While the festival reached its height, the Spaniards attacked. Steel cut through feathers, swords slashed into bare backs. Unarmed dancers, artists, priests, butchered mid-ceremony. Blood flooded the plaza where prayers had just been spoken. Drums stopped, screams rose, chaos followed, no warning, no mercy. Why did they do it? Some say the Spaniards feared an uprising. Others say they acted out of greed, jealous of the wealth, gold, and display. Whatever the motive, the result was the same. Trust was dead. Tenochtitlan exploded. Rage surged through every canal, every temple, every house. The nobles who had hesitated no longer questioned. Moctezuma's status as a mediator was shattered. His people no longer saw a ruler. They saw a prisoner controlled by butchers. The mask had fallen. Cortés thought he could hold the city by holding its king. But now, with the blood of nobles staining sacred ground, he had turned an uneasy occupation into an all-out war. Part 6. The Night of Sorrows, the Year of Vengeance. La Noche Triste. June 30th, 1520. Aztec rebellion explodes. Moctezuma killed Stone, Spaniards, both. Tenochtitlan had erupted. The massacre at Tenochtitlan had shattered the silence. And now the city's fury had no limit. Barricades rose in hours. Causeways were cut. Bridges pulled. Every street turned hostile. Canoes clogged canals. The same people who had watched Cortés walk in now stalked him from rooftops. Stone, fire, and rage poured from every direction. The spell of diplomacy was dead. The Spaniards were trapped. Inside the palace, surrounded, outnumbered, desperate, Cortés reached for his last bargaining chip. Moctezuma. He forced the emperor to speak to his people. Moctezuma, weakened, humiliated, still wearing the headdress of rule but no longer its power, stepped onto the roof under armed guard. He raised his voice, not in command, but in plea. He asked for calm. He urged surrender. He begged his people to stop. They answered with stones. What happened next is a mystery, sealed in smoke and panic. Some accounts say the crowd struck him with rocks, shards of flint crashing against the same body they had once worshipped. Others claim the Spaniards, realizing he had lost control, ended his life themselves. A dagger to the chest. A swift betrayal to remove the last symbol of a collapsing order. What is known is this: Moctezuma died in captivity. His body broken, his authority erased. The living god of the Mexica was reduced to a corpse surrounded by foreigners. No one wept. His death didn't calm the rebellion, it intensified it. The city that had once moved to the rhythm of sacrifice and tribute now surged with vengeance. Every man, woman, and warrior became part of the resistance. No more ceremonies, no more tolerance. The people would not negotiate, they would eradicate. For the first time since the arrival of Cortés, the Spaniards were not seen as visitors or even invaders. They were enemies to be wiped from the earth. No tribute demanded, no terms accepted, only blood. Spanish flee in darkness across canals. Hundreds die. It was the dead of night when they made their move, because daylight meant death. The Spaniards were cornered, bleeding supplies, and burning through time. Tenochtitlan had turned into a fortress of fury. No reinforcements, no food, no trust. Surrounded on all sides, Cortés had only one option left: run. Under a moonless sky, they loaded stolen gold onto horses and backs, hoping to slip through the dark like ghosts. Across the causeways, through silent courtyards, down narrow alleys, they moved in tense, whispered columns. The air was thick with dread. Every wooden step creaked with betrayal. They carried the weight of greed and failure together. But the Mexica were watching. They struck not with surprise, but with precision. Warriors waded in canoes. Archers lined rooftops. Axemen stood at every choke point. As the Spanish column stretched across the Tlacopan causeway, the attack began. Arrows cut through shadows. War cries shattered the silence. Canoes rammed the flanks. Pikes jabbed from the water. Chaos erupted. Horses panicked. Soldiers slipped on blood-slick planks. Bodies crashed into the canals. Those who couldn't swim sank fast, dragged down by gold meant to buy glory. Treasure became an anchor. Men drowned, clutching it to their chests. Cortés fought his way through, wounded but alive. Others were not so lucky. Some were captured, dragged back into the city, and saved for rituals far worse than death. The causeway ran red with blood. Over 400 Spaniards fell, along with thousands of native allies caught in the slaughter. By dawn, the survivors, shattered, soaked, and sobered, collapsed on the shores outside the city. Cortés, staring at what remained of his force, wept beneath a lone tree. It would be remembered as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. But for the Mexica, it wasn't sorrow, it was justice. The invaders had come uninvited, and now they were reminded. This city belonged to its own. Gold stolen, bodies sink. Cortés weeps under a tree. The causeways were slick with blood. Canoes drifted aimlessly in the canals, some empty, some weighted with what floated just below the surface. Armor, limbs, gold. The retreat was over. It wasn't an escape, it was a collapse. And when the last man staggered out of the mist and into the tree line, the truth settled like ash. The Spanish force had been ripped apart. In the scramble for survival, they had tried to carry wealth stolen from the very heart of the Mexican Empire. Bars of gold, discs of sun, necklaces torn from temples. But greed has weight, and when feet slipped and bridges broke, that weight pulled them under. Men sank by the dozens, dragged to the lake bed by what they thought would make them kings. Gold turned into a grave. Bodies vanished into black water, vanishing as if the city itself was swallowing its revenge. And Cortés, the commander who had once dared to burn his ships, who had entered Tenochtitlan with ambition carved into every step, now sat broken at the edge of it all. Alone beneath a tree, surrounded by silence and ruin, he wept. Not for the dead, not even for the city. He wept for what had slipped through his fingers. The gold, the power, the dream of taking an empire in one swift move. Gone. His men were scattered, his allies thinned, his reputation bleeding into the soil. The weight of what he had caused crashed down all at once. He had come for glory. He had found a nightmare. This was not the end of the war, but it was the end of illusion. The Aztecs had been underestimated. The conquest had been romanticized. And now, as Cortés stared into the empty distance from under that tree, he understood something with perfect clarity. Tenochtitlan would not fall easily. And from this moment forward, nothing would come without fire and death. The Siege of Tenochtitlan, May to August 1521. Cortés regroups with Tlaxcalan and Huexotzinco forces. He should have been finished. After the massacre, the betrayal, and the slaughter on the causeways, Cortés had lost half his men, nearly all his supplies, and the myth of invincibility that once protected him. But he still had one weapon left: alliance. As the remnants of his force limped east, broken but breathing, Cortés set his eyes once again on the people who had helped him rise before, the Tlaxcalans. This time, he returned not as a commander, but as a survivor. The Tlaxcalan leaders, who had watched the fall of so many rivals at the hands of the Mexica, saw in his defeat an opportunity, not for pity, but for strategy. They had spilled their own blood beside him. Now they would spill more, with a purpose. Tenochtitlan had humiliated them for generations. This was their chance to burn the heart out of an enemy that had mocked their resistance for too long. Huexotzinco joined next, a fiercely independent city with its own long memory of Aztec aggression. They knew what it meant to be taxed, raided, and sacrificed. When Cortés arrived at their gates, wounded and desperate, they didn't see a foreigner to reject. They saw a fire to feed. What rose from these alliances wasn't just a recovery. It was a recalibration. Cortés now commanded a force unlike anything he had led before. Thousands of native warriors, hardened by decades of local war, backed by knowledge of terrain, supply routes, and enemy customs. These weren't auxiliaries, they were equals with a shared vendetta. Weapons were reforged, scouts spread across the valley, plans were drawn, not for escape, but for siege. This was no longer about conquest, it was about payback, and in the mountains east of the lake, a new coalition was forming. One not built on trust, but on shared scars. Cortés would lead, but this time it wouldn't be the Spanish alone who came for Tenochtitlan. It would be the revenants of every wrong the empire had inflicted. And they would return not in chains or silence, but in waves, because the war had entered its final chapter, and it would not be written in negotiation. It would be carved in vengeance. smallpox devastates Aztec population, 40 to 50% dead. The sword did not bring the Aztec Empire to its knees. Disease did. As the empire braced for a second wave of war, a silent enemy had already slipped through its defenses: smallpox. It came not with fanfare, but on a breath. It traveled faster than horses, struck harder than steel, and killed without distinction. No warning, no cure. The first signs were dismissed as fever, skin blistered, eyes swelled shut, flesh cracked and oozed. Within days, victims were unrecognizable. Entire families vanished. Entire districts went quiet. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Temples turned into morgues. Priests burned herbs, chanted prayers, pleaded with gods. Nothing answered. The disease, brought by one infected Spanish slave, tore through the capital and spread outward like wildfire. 40 to 50% of the population dead in weeks. The empire's core wasn't just attacked, it was hollowed from within. But this wasn't just a human tragedy, it was a military collapse. Generals succumbed, messengers stopped running. Engineers who managed the city's waterworks died mid-task. Warriors fell in their barracks. Healers collapsed beside the patients they couldn't save. And leadership, already shaken by the death of Moctezuma, fractured under the weight of a dying population. The empire had built itself on order, ritual, and collective will. Smallpox turned that into ash. It struck the young, the strong, the trained. It made planning impossible, resistance unpredictable. People lost faith, not just in their rulers, but in the gods who had once demanded sacrifice and now gave nothing in return. And all the while, Cortés waited. He didn't need to attack. He let the plague do his work. As his own forces recovered, the city across the lake suffered in silence. The drums that once roared across the water were quiet. The smoke that once signaled strength no longer rose. The Aztecs had faced countless enemies before, but this time they couldn't fight back. There was nothing to kill, no army to charge, just a disease that spread faster than fear and left nothing behind but corpses and confusion. Tenochtitlan was not just wounded, it was rotting from the inside out. Brutal siege, starvation, disease, city bombarded. What followed was not a battle, it was a strangulation. Cortés returned to Tenochtitlan in May of 1521. This time, he didn't march in, he encircled it. With Tlaxcalan armies, Huexotzinco allies, and fresh Spanish reinforcements, he launched a siege so calculated, so merciless, it drained the life out of the empire by inches. Tenochtitlan, once proud, once impenetrable, was cut off completely. 3 causeways, all controlled, all severed. No food came in, no messengers left. The lake, once the city's strength, became its prison. Spanish-built brigantines, floating gunships armed with cannons, dominated the water. Canoes were hunted down, every attempt to flee intercepted. Every island around the capital either turned or destroyed. Starvation gripped the city like a fist. Grain stores dried up. Rats, lizards, grass, even dirt soaked in broth became meals. Mothers gave water instead of milk. Children died in corners while their fathers held crumbling spears. There was no room for burials. Corpses lay in streets, swarming with flies. The living walked past them without flinching. Then came disease, not just smallpox now, but typhus, dysentery, infection. Every open wound became a death sentence. Every shared bowl another chance to fall ill. Clean water turned foul. The sacred canals stank of rot. The rituals had stopped. The drums were silent. The gods were distant. And still, the city held. Cortés responded with bombardment. From land, his artillery shattered buildings. From the water, brigantines launched volley after volley into temple walls, towers, and bridges. Markets crumbled, homes ignited, temples bled stone. Every explosion sent dust clouds skyward and panic through the city. There were no reinforcements, no escape routes, no ceasefires, only ash and agony. Every day, another district collapsed, Every night the defenders were fewer, but they fought. Despite hunger, despite wounds, despite knowing they were surrounded, betrayed, and dying, the warriors of Tenochtitlan did not surrender. They ambushed at night. They rebuilt barricades by morning. They took stones to block bullets and arrows to answer steel. It wasn't enough. Tenochtitlan was not falling all at once. It was being taken apart, block by block, breath by breath. Streets run red with blood. Temples defiled. By the end, there were no safe places left in Tenochtitlan. The great avenues, once swept clean by attendants and lined with banners, now drowned in mud and blood. Once majestic causeways collapsed under bodies. The canals, once precise and sacred, choked with the dead. The city was no longer alive. It was bleeding out. Spanish forces and native allies poured into the shattered districts like floodwater, house by house, temple by temple. Resistance didn't break. It was burned out. Fires spread across neighborhoods that had stood for centuries. Roofs caved in. Altars cracked. Priests fell beside warriors, fighting with obsidian knives and bare hands until the end. Cortés had no mercy left to give. His men tore through sacred sites, pried open ceremonial chambers, stripped gold from statues. What couldn't be looted was smashed. What couldn't be taken was defiled. The Templo Mayor, once the axis of faith and power, was climbed not by pilgrims, but by killers. On its steps, blood flowed in a direction it was never meant to. The rites once performed with reverence were drowned in vengeance. The gods were silenced beneath smoke and screams. Ritual scrolls burned. Stone carvings shattered. Idols decapitated. The empire's sacred memory erased in hours. Survivors fled into collapsed tunnels, starved ruins, and flame-lit alleys. Children cried over bodies. The air reeked of char and copper. And still, Cortés pushed forward, until nothing stood but rubble and silence. What had taken generations to build was reduced to ruins soaked in crimson. Tenochtitlan, the city that once fed the sun, was now a graveyard that swallowed the sky. And in its final breath, the empire that had once ruled by fear was consumed by something far crueler: obliteration. Part 7. Fall of the Gods. The fall of Tenochtitlan, August 13, 1521. Last Emperor Cuauhtémoc captured, resists torture with legendary stoicism. When the fires died and the last screams fell silent, one figure still stood: Cuauhtémoc, the final Tlatoani of the Mexica. He had taken the mantle after the empire had already begun to crack, after the plague, after the siege had begun. He was young, unproven, and yet in the final months, he became the unbreakable face of defiance. He didn't flee. He didn't bend. As the city fell around him, he led what remained of his forces through the shattered maze of temples and barricades. He fought not to win, but to deny victory. Every ambush, every counterstrike, every desperate move delayed the inevitable. But when there was nothing left to defend, when the streets were thick with ruin, he made a final escape attempt across the lake. He didn't make it far. His canoe was intercepted. He was dragged from the water, beaten, exhausted, surrounded. But even in chains, he met Cortés with a stare sharp enough to cut steel. He didn't beg. He didn't plead. He offered his neck. "If you come for me," he said, "take this dagger and end it now." Cortés didn't kill him. Not yet. He kept him alive, to break him. The Spanish demanded to know where the treasures of the empire were hidden, where the last gold had gone, where the symbols of Mexican greatness had been buried or scattered. But Cuauhtémoc gave them nothing. So they tortured him. They burned his feet. They pressed hot iron to flesh. They tried to tear answers out through agony. He said nothing. His pain echoed through the halls of the broken city, but his words never cracked. At one point, a noble beside him screamed for mercy. Cuauhtémoc turned to him, not with pity, but with resolve, and spoke the line that would become legend. "Am I on a bed of roses?" Not sarcasm, not mockery. A final, quiet refusal to let his enemies see him collapse. He would not give them gold. He would not give them fear, and he would not give them the satisfaction of watching a king beg. The last emperor of the Mexica went down as the only man left standing in spirit when the empire itself had already fallen. His body broken, but his will intact, Cuauhtémoc became the flame that refused to die in a world buried under ash. Tenochtitlan burns, temples toppled, canals filled. It didn't end with surrender, it ended with fire. Cortés didn't rebuild Tenochtitlan, he erased it. What had stood for centuries, stone by stone, god by god, was brought down with deliberate force. Temples that once reached for the sky were pulled down, block by block. Sacred altars crushed under Spanish boots. The twin shrines at the heart of the empire, once drenched in the blood of sacrifice, were now reduced to rubble by pickaxe and cannon. But the destruction didn't stop with the monuments. The canals, the veins of the city, were filled in. What once carried food, goods, and ritual processions became burial trenches for stone and bone. The very water that had given the city life was turned into mud. Roads were built where rivers once flowed. The soul of Tenochtitlan's design, its genius, its rhythm, was choked and flattened beneath a new vision. Fires spread across what remained. Entire districts were torched. Homes turned to cinders, scrolls, codices, paintings. The empire's memory burned in piles. There was no preservation, no attempt to understand, only conquest. The Spaniards didn't come to inherit the city. They came to bury it. Ash fell like snow. Smoke blotted out the sun. Survivors coughed through the haze, watching the skyline vanish. What had been a crown jewel of Mesoamerican civilization was now a smoking scar. When the final temple wall crashed into the dust, a silence fell over the lake. Tenochtitlan, once a miracle floating on water, was now just charred earth beneath foreign boots. And in its place, the foundations of a new city were laid, not to honor the past, but to dominate it. Mexico City was born, but beneath its streets, the ashes of an empire still smoldered. Civilization dies with ritual, not silence. A city can burn, a kingdom can fall. But a civilization does not die quietly. Even in defeat, the Mexica turned to what had always defined them, ritual. In their last moments, surrounded by ash, hunted by steel, weakened by famine, they still chose meaning over surrender. As the final districts crumbled, priests carried out secret ceremonies in hidden chambers. Sacred fires were relit with coals saved from the ruins. The last maize was not eaten, it was offered. The remaining idols, cracked and headless, were not abandoned. They were wrapped, blessed, and buried beneath the rubble. Some warriors chose to end their lives not in battle, but in ritual sacrifice, believing that even in ruin, their blood might reach the gods. Mothers sang old hymns to children too sick to stand. Elders whispered creation stories with trembling breath. Dying men painted their faces in war colors, not to fight, but to die as Mexica. Not as slaves, not as victims, but as part of a cycle that stretched beyond conquest. And when the last drum beat out its final echo, not in a temple, but from a hidden alley, it was not the sound of submission. It was the sound of memory being carried across generations. Cortés could level cities. He could rename lakes and rebuild streets. He could erect crosses where pyramids once rose. But he could not erase the soul that clung to the ruins. Because this civilization did not end with a whimper. It ended the way it lived, through ritual, blood, and defiance. And though the fire consumed the empire's body, its spirit refused to go out. Part 8. Ashes, Echoes, and Survival. Aftermath. Colonial Mexico and cultural erosion. Spanish rebuild Mexico City over Tenochtitlan's bones. They didn't just conquer Tenochtitlan, they built over its corpse. Within months of the fall, the Spanish began tearing down what remained. Not to erase the past, but to stand on top of it. Stones from broken temples were hauled by enslaved survivors to construct churches, palaces, and military quarters. The pyramids were reduced to quarries. The sacred plazas were paved over to make colonial roads. What couldn't be carted away was buried, literally smothered beneath foundations of a new world. The lake, once the city's lifeblood, was drained. Canals were filled with rubble. The floating system that had once fed hundreds of thousands was abandoned. Swamps replaced gardens. Stagnant pools replaced symmetry. The Mexica vision of harmony between city and nature was uprooted, permanently. And on that ruined ground, the Spanish raised something else. Mexico City. It rose fast, not by ingenuity, but by domination. Streets were redrawn in straight lines. Plazas were cleared for markets and gallows. The cathedral loomed where gods once stood. A new legal order arrived, backed by steel, ink, and scripture. Nahuatl was pushed aside for Castilian. Priests arrived with crosses in one hand and fire in the other. Baptisms were done in bulk. Resistance was handled without ceremony. The empire's capital was not restored, it was replaced. The Spanish wanted the land, the wealth, the location, but not the soul. That was crushed beneath stone and silence. The few surviving nobles were allowed to live, so long as they bowed. Former warriors were conscripted into labor. Scribes were forced to copy under foreign watch. The children of priests were sent to Christian schools, taught to forget their lineage. From above, the city looked new. From below, it groaned under the weight of the dead. Mexico City was born as a monument not to coexistence, but to conquest. And every time a colonist walked its streets, they did so over bones that once ruled an empire. Mass forced conversions, destruction of codices. The sword had done its job. Now came the cross. Once the Spanish secured the land, they moved swiftly to reshape the minds. The goal wasn't just rule, it was erasure. If the Mexica world could not be fully extinguished in battle, it would be dismantled through belief. Mass conversions began almost immediately. Priests were dispatched across the ruins of the empire, armed with holy water and backed by armed men. They baptized entire populations by force. Whole villages were marched to rivers and fountains. Names were stripped. Indigenous gods were declared demons. Infants were baptized before they could speak. Adults who refused were labeled heretics, or worse, witches. The rituals that had once structured life, naming ceremonies, harvest prayers, solstice offerings, were banned. Temples were demolished or repurposed into churches. Those who performed native rites in secret risked flogging, imprisonment, or execution. Spiritual leaders who survived the siege were made examples, publicly humiliated, imprisoned, or killed. And the final blow came in silence: the destruction of the codices. These books were not pages, they were memory. Brightly painted deer, hide, bark, and cloth, folded like accordions, filled with generations of knowledge. Medicine, astronomy, law, genealogy, philosophy, poetry, prophecy, all inked by steady hands over centuries. The Spanish viewed them as pagan filth, dangerous, heretical, unholy. They were gathered in piles and burned. Libraries turned to ash. Priceless knowledge reduced to glowing embers. Some friars, like Diego de Landa in the Maya regions, even recorded the number of codices they burned, as if proud of the purge. A handful survived, hidden by scribes who risked their lives, smuggled, buried, or secretly copied under Spanish noses. But the vast majority, the intellectual heart of an entire civilization, was lost forever. This wasn't just religious zeal. It was calculated cultural decapitation. The gods had already been torn down. Now, their voices were being extinguished from memory itself. And the people who remained, still breathing, still watching, were left to wear the mask of a faith they never asked for, in a world rebuilt atop the ashes of their truth. Remaining nobles used as middlemen for Spanish rule. The empire had fallen, but not every noble was executed. Some were kept alive for utility. The Spanish, though ruthless, understood the value of structure. They didn't have the manpower to govern every village, every temple, every province, so they turned to those who once held power: the surviving Mexica aristocracy. They were stripped of their thrones, but not their influence. Their temples were gone, their armies broken, but their names still carried weight among their people. And that made them useful. These former lords were offered a grim bargain: serve the crown or lose everything. Many complied, not out of loyalty, but out of survival. They became intermediaries between the Spanish and the native population. Tax collectors, translators, enforcers, spies. They managed tribute systems for their new masters and reported disobedience in their own communities. They wore European clothes, signed documents they could not always read, and repeated laws they didn't believe in. Their palaces became offices, their titles became tools. To their people, they were no longer leaders. They were shadows of authority, standing between oppression and rebellion. But some played a longer game. A few used their new positions to shield their people, to delay land seizures, to preserve hidden shrines, to hide surviving codices in stone walls and beneath church floors. They walked a line between betrayal and preservation, between dignity and obedience. History remembers them with conflict, some as traitors, others as quiet resistors wearing the enemy's mask. The Spanish needed them to pacify the land, but they never trusted them. And the nobles, they bowed but never forgot. Because while their gods were silenced and their cities torn down, they had learned one lesson from empire. Power always survives if it knows when to disappear. Legacy: the empire that lives in bones. Aztec language, Nahuatl. Still spoken by over 1.5 million. They burned the temples. They shattered the gods. They buried the city beneath stone and silence. But they could not kill the language. Nahuatl, the lifeblood of the Mexica world, survived. Spoken in markets, sung in rituals, whispered in homes. It outlived every emperor, every conquistador, every priest that tried to silence it. The words carried memory. The rhythm held identity. Even as crosses replaced shrines and Spanish filled the courts, Nahuatl endured, not as defiance, but as inheritance. It was passed down in lullabies and proverbs. It shaped the names of rivers, volcanoes, and villages. It echoed through generations in prayer and protest, in cornfields and council halls. While the laws were written in Castilian, the people still argued, dreamed, and mourned in Nahuatl. And today, more than 500 years after Tenochtitlan fell, over 1.5 million people still speak it, not as a relic, not as nostalgia, but as a living language, a declaration that the empire may have fallen, but its soul never surrendered. You can still hear the voice of the Mexica in the highlands, in classrooms, in poetry, in ceremony. It is spoken by farmers and scholars, activists and elders, carried in breath like sacred fire. And with every word spoken, every syllable kept alive, something becomes clear. Conquest erased cities, it buried gods, but it could not silence a people. Nahuatl lives, and in it, so does the echo of empire. Modern Mexico's flag, festivals, pride, trace roots to Aztec past. Empires fall, cities crumble, but symbols endure. Modern Mexico, its colors, its pulse, its pride, still beats with the heart of the Aztec past. Look at the flag. That eagle devouring a snake atop a cactus? That's not a modern invention. It's the prophecy that led the Mexica to their promised land. It's Tenochtitlan's founding vision, a myth made national. Today, it flies from government buildings and clenched fists alike. A reminder that before colonial lines were drawn, this land already had a destiny. Step into a festival. You'll hear drums that once echoed through sacred plazas. You'll see dancers in feathered headdresses, spinning like the warriors of old. You'll taste foods rooted in ancient recipes, maize, cacao, chile, prepared the same way for centuries. These aren't recreations, they're continuations. Living rituals disguised as celebration. Even the language of pride, words like Cuautle, eagle, Tlatoani, leader, Mexica, find their way into chants, tattoos, classroom walls, and activist speeches. To be Mexican today is to carry pieces of that shattered empire, not in chains, but in honor. The Aztec past is not locked in museums. It walks the streets, it sings in markets, it rises in protests and ceremonies. Every child who learns Nahuatl, every altar rebuilt for Dia de los Muertos, every mural painted in defiance of forgetting, that is a legacy refusing to vanish. Because what the conquistadors failed to understand is that burning a city doesn't erase a civilization. It just plants its roots deeper, and 5 centuries later, those roots still hold. Rediscovery. Templo Mayor unearthed in 1978. For centuries, the world believed the empire was gone, buried forever beneath the streets of modern Mexico City. Concrete had swallowed stone. Time had sealed what conquest couldn't. But in 1978, the Earth gave up a secret it had guarded for nearly 500 years. A group of electric company workers were digging downtown when they struck something hard. Not rock, not rubble, stone, cut and carved. They had hit the edge of the Templo Mayor. What followed wasn't just an archaeological excavation, it was a resurrection. Piece by piece, layer by layer, the sacred heart of the Aztec capital emerged from the soil. Skulls, altars, statues, offering chambers. Buried deities returned to the light. Serpents carved from volcanic stone. Golden masks and obsidian blades. Even the massive circular monolith of Coyolxauhqui, the moon goddess dismembered by her brother Huitzilopochtli, was unearthed with chilling precision. The Spanish had built their cathedral atop this exact place, a symbol of dominance. But now, from under the cathedral's shadow, the gods of Tenochtitlan were rising. And suddenly, the myth wasn't myth anymore. The eagle on the flag had a nest. The stories had a stage. The whispers of the fallen empire became a roar from underground. The rediscovery didn't just rewrite textbooks. It shattered the illusion that the conquest had buried the past. Because the Templo Mayor had never vanished. It had simply waited. And when it rose again, so did the memory of a civilization that refused to stay dead. The duality of beauty and brutality in one of humanity's most striking civilizations. The Aztec Empire did not exist in halves. It was beauty and brutality, art and agony, flowers and flayed skin, in equal, unapologetic measure. This was a civilization where poets composed verses to the gods, while warriors tore out hearts beneath the same sun, where floating gardens fed millions, and blood soaked the altars just across the canal, where astronomers charted Venus with precision, and captives were marched by torchlight for sacrifice. There was no contradiction in their world, only balance. They believed life required death, that creation demanded destruction, that the sun itself would fall unless fed with flesh. Their pyramids weren't just monuments, they were engines for the cosmos. Their wars weren't only for conquest, they were ceremonies. Their politics weren't driven by gold, but by divine obligation. And this duality, this strange and haunting symmetry, is why their legacy endures. Because you cannot study the Aztec world and feel indifferent. You either marvel or recoil, often both. They were not saints, they were not savages, they were something else entirely. Human, at their most glorious and at their most terrifying. And in their fall, we see the price of empire. In their rise, we glimpse the power of belief, and in what survives, the language, the ruins, the myths. We find a civilization that still stares back at us from the edge of time. Neither forgotten nor forgiven, but undeniable. The Aztecs were not a chapter in history. They were a mirror, and it's still cracked with blood and gold. The empire that fed the sun. The Aztecs ruled for just under a century, a blink in the lifeline of empires. But time doesn't measure impact in years, it measures it in aftershocks, and theirs still rumble through history. Because this wasn't just a people, it was a vision. A worldview built on fire and precision. A society that mapped the stars with one hand and cut open chests with the other. A capital that floated on water but stood like stone. A faith that bled, willingly, to keep the sky from collapsing, their empire fell. But its bones were never buried deep enough. You hear it in the Nahuatl spoken in mountain towns. You taste it in maize. You walk it when you cross streets that were once canals. You see it every day in a flag that bears their omen. The obsidian blades are quiet now. The drums no longer thunder. But the memory is carved in fire. The empire is gone, but its spirit lives. In names, in blood, in the burning question that still dares to haunt every soul bold enough to remember. What would you give to keep the sun alive?